Castro culture is the archaeological term for the material Celtic culture of the northwestern regions of the Iberian Peninsula from the end of the Bronze Age until it was subsumed by Roman culture. The most notable characteristics of this culture are its walled oppidron hill forts, known locally as castras, from Latin castrum, castle, and the scarcity of visible burial practices. In spite of the frequent depositions of prestige items and goods, swords and other metallic riches in rocky outcrops, rivers and other aquatic contexts since the Atlantic Bronze Age, this cultural area extended east to the Cares River and south into the lower Douro River Valley. The area of Avenue Valley was the core region of this culture, with a large number of small Castro settlements, but also including larger oppida. The cividades, some known as Satanias by archaeologists, due to their city-like structure. Cividade de Baganta, Cividade de Terraço, Satania de Briteros, and Satania de Sanfins. History. The Castro culture emerged during the first 2 centuries of the first millennium BCE, in the region extending from the Douro River up to the Minho, but soon expanding north along the coast, and east following the river valleys, reaching the mountain ranges which separate the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula from the Central Plateau or Meseta. It was the result of the autonomous evolution of Atlantic Bronze Age communities. After the local collapse of the long-range Atlantic network of interchange of prestige items, the end of the Atlantic Bronze Age from the Mondego River up to the Minho River, along the coastal areas of northern Portugal. During the last 2 centuries of the second millennium BCE, a series of settlements were established in high, well-communicated places, or radiating from a core area north of the Mondego, and usually specializing themselves in the production of Atlantic Bronze Age metallurgy. Cauldrons, knives, bronze vases, roasting spits, flesh hooks, swords, axes and jewelry, related to a noble elite who celebrated ritual banquets and who participated in an extensive network of interchange of prestige items. From the Mediterranean and up to the British Isles, these villages were closely related to the open settlements which characterized the First Bronze Age, frequently established near the valleys and the richer agricultural lands. From the beginning of the first millennium, the network appears to collapse, probably because the Iron Age had outdated the Atlantic tin and bronze products in the Mediterranean region, and the large-scale production of metallic items was reduced to the elaboration of axes and tools, which are still found buried in very large quantities all along the European Atlantic coast. Formative period. During the transition of the Bronze to the Iron Age, from the Douro in modern northern Portugal and up along the coasts of Galicia until the central regions of Asturias, the settlement in artificially fortified places substituted the old open settlement model. These early hill forts were small, being situated in hills, peninsulas or in other naturally defended places, usually endued with long-range visibility. Its artificial defences were initially just composed of earthen walls, battlements and ditches, which enclosed an inner habitable space. This space was mostly void, non-urbanized, used for communal activities, and it comprised just some few circular, oblong, or rounded squared huts, of some 5 to 15 meters of largest dimension, built with wood, vegetable materials and mud, sometimes reinforced with stony low walls. The major inner feature of these multifunctional undivided cabins were the hearth, circular or quadrangular, and which conditioned the uses of the other spaces of the room. In essence, the main characteristic of this formative period is the assumption by the community of a larger authority at the expenses of the elites, reflected in the minor importance of the prestige items production, while the collective inverted important resources and labor in the communal spaces and defenses. Second Iron Age. Since the beginning of the 6th century BCE, the Castro culture experienced an inner expansion. Hundreds of new hill forts were founded, while some older small ones were abandoned for new emplacements. These new settlements were founded near valleys, in the vicinity of the richest farmlands, and these are generally protected by several defense lines, composed of ramparts, ditches, and sound stony walls, probably built not only as a defensive apparatus but also as a feature which could confer prestige to the community. Sometimes, human remains have been found in cists or under the walls, implying some kind of foundational protective ritual. Not only did the number of settlements grow during this period, but also their size and density. First, the old familiar huts were frequently substituted by groups of family housing, composed generally of one or more huts with hearth, plus round granaries, and elongated or square sheds and workshops. At the same time, these houses and groups tended to occupy most of the internal room of the hill forts, reducing the communitarian open spaces, which in turn would have been substituted by other facilities such as saunas, communitarian halls, and shared forges. Although most of the communities of this period had mostly self-sufficient isolated economies, one important change was the return of trade with the Mediterranean by the now independent Carthage, a thriving Western Mediterranean power. Carthaginian merchants brought imports of wine, glass, pottery and other goods through a series of emporia, commercial posts which sometimes included temples and other installations. At the same time, the archaeological register shows, through the finding of large quantities of fibulae, pins, pincers for hair extraction, pendants, earrings, torques, bracelets, and other personal objects, the ongoing importance of the individual and his or her physical appearance. While the archaeological record of the Castro Iron Age suggests a very egalitarian society, these findings imply the development of a privileged class with better access to prestige items. The Oppida from the 2nd century BC, especially in the south, some of the hill forts turned into semi-urban fortified towns. Oppida, their remains are locally known as cividadas or cidadas, cities, with populations of some few thousand inhabitants, such as Cividade de Baganta, Briteros, San Fins, San Cibrao de las, or Santa Tegra. Some of them were even larger than the cities, Bracara Augusta and Lucas Augusta, that Rome established a century later. These native cities were characterized by their size and by urban features such as paved streets equipped with channels for stormwater runoff, reservoirs of potable water, and evidence of urban planning. Many of them also presented an inner and upper walled space, relatively large and scarcely urbanized, called acropole by local scholars. These oppida were generally surrounded by concentric ditches and stone walls, up to 5 in Briteros, sometimes reinforced with towers. Gates to these oppida become monumental and frequently have sculptures of warriors. The oppida's dwelling areas are frequently externally walled, and kitchens, sheds, granaries, workshops and living rooms are ordered around an inner paved yard, sometimes equipped with fountains, drains and reservoirs. Cividade de Baganta was one of the largest cities with 50 hectares. The cities are surrounded by a number of smaller castros, some of which may have been defensive outposts of cities, such as Castro de Laundos. That was probably an outpost of Cividade de Terraso. A cividade may also have been the origin of Bracara Augusta, although there are no archaeological findings apart from an ancient parish name and pre-Roman baths. Bracara Augusta later became the capital of the Roman province of Gallaecia, which encompassed all the lands once participant of the Castro culture. Roman era. The first meeting of Rome with the inhabitants of the castros and cividades was during the Punic Wars, when Carthaginians hired local mercenaries for fighting Rome in the Mediterranean and into Italy. Later on, Gallaecians backed Lusitanians fighting Romans, and as a result the Roman general Decimus Junius Brutus Callaeacus led a successful punishment expedition into the north in 137 BCE. The victory he celebrated in Rome granted him the title Callaeacus. During the next century, Galaretia was still theatre of operation for Perpenna, Julius Caesar and the generals of Augustus, but only after the Romans defeated the Asturians and Cantabrians in 19 BCE is evident. Thought inscriptions, numismatic and other archaeological findings, the submission of the local powers to Rome. While the 1st century BCE represents an era of expansion and maturity for the Castro culture, under Roman influence and with the local economy apparently powered more than hindered by Roman commerce and wars. During the next century, the control of Roma became political and military, and for the first time in more than a millennium new unfortified settlements were established in the plains and valleys, at the same time that numerous hill forts and cities were abandoned. Strabo wrote, probably describing this process, until they were stopped by the Romans, who humiliated them and reduced most of their cities to mere villages. The culture went through somewhat of a transformation, as a result of the Roman conquest and formation of the Roman province of Galaretia in the heart of the Castro cultural area. By the 2nd century CE, most hill forts and oppida had been abandoned or reused as sanctuaries or worshipping places, but some others kept being occupied up to the 5th century, when the Germanic Suevi established themselves in Galaretia. Economy and arts. As stated, while Bronze Age economy was based on the exploitation and exportation of mineral local resources, tin and copper, and on mass production and long-range distribution of prestige items, Iron Age economy was based on an economy of necessity goods, as most items and productions were obtained in situ, or interchanged. Thought short-range commerce. Anyway, in the southern coastal areas the presence of Mediterranean merchants from the 6th century BC onward would have occasioned an increase in social inequality, bringing a large number of importations and technological innovations, such as round granite millstones, which would have merged with the Atlantic local traditions. Ancient Roman military presence in the south and east of the Iberian Peninsula since the 2nd century BC would have reinforced the role of the autochthonous warrior elites, with better access to local prestige items and importations. Food and food production. Pollen analyses confirms the Iron Age as a period of intense deforestation in Galicia and northern Portugal, with meadows and fields expanding at the expense of woodland. Using 3 main types of tools, plows, sickles and hoes, together with axes for woodcutting, the Castro inhabitants grew a number of cereals for baking bread, as well as oats and barley, which they also used for beer production. They also grew beans, peas and cabbage, and flax for fabric and clothes production. Other vegetables were collected: nettle, watercress. Large quantities of acorns have been found hoarded in most hill forts, as they were used for bread production once toasted and crushed in granite stone mills. The second pillar of local economy was animal husbandry. Galaretians bred cattle for meat, milk and butter production. They also used oxen for dragging carts and plows, while horses were used mainly for human transportation. They also bred sheep and goats for meat and wool, and pigs for meat. Wild animals like deer or boars were frequently chased. In coastal areas, fishing and collecting shellfish were important activities. Strabo wrote that the people of northern Iberia used boats made of leather, probably similar to Irish currachs and Welsh coracles, for local navigation. Archaeologists have found hooks and weights for nets, as well as open seas fish remains, confirming inhabitants of the coastal areas as fishermen. Metallurgy. Mining was an integral part of the culture, and it attracted Mediterranean merchants, first Phoenicians, later Carthaginians and Romans. Gold, iron, copper, tin and lead were the most common ores mined. Castro metallurgy refined the metals from ores and cast them to make various tools. During the initial centuries of the first millennium BC, bronze was still the most used metal, although iron was progressively introduced. Main products include tools, domestic items, and weapons. During the initial Iron Age, the local artisans stopped producing some of the most characteristic Bronze Age items such as carp tongue, leaf-shaped and rapier swords, double-ringed axes, breastplates and most jewelry. At the same time, new type of items, such as fibulae and pendant-type earrings, initially based in Mediterranean models, were produced, while some other types were reactivated, mostly based on Central and Atlantic European models and under direct or indirect Mediterranean influences. Gold torques frequently having large, void terminals, containing little stones which allowed them to be also used as rattles, antenna-hilted swords and knives, Montefortino helmets with local decoration, and sacrificial or votive axes depicting themselves complex sacrificial scenes, with torques, cauldrons, weapons, animals of diverse species and string-like motifs. Decorative motifs include rosettes, triskelions, swastikas, spirals, interlaces, as well as palm tree, herringbone and string motifs, many of which were still carved in Romanesque churches, and are still used today in local folk art and traditional items in Galicia, Portugal and northern Spain. These same motifs were also extensively used in stone decoration. Castro sculpture also revealed that locals carved these figures in wood items, such as chairs, and weaved them into their clothes. Stonework. While the use of stone for constructions is an old tradition in the Castro culture, dating from the first centuries of the first millennium BC, sculpture only became usual from the 2nd century BC, especially in the southern half of the territory, associated to the Oppida. 5 main types are produced, all of them in granite stone. Guerreros or warrior statues, usually representing a male warrior in a standing pose, holding ready a short sword and a kyatra, and wearing a cap or helmet, torque, virai and decorated shirt, skirt and belt. Sitting statues. They usually depict what is considered to be a god sitting on a decorated throne, wearing virai or bracelets, and holding a cup or pot. Although the motives are autochthonous, their model are clearly Mediterranean. Nevertheless, unlike the Gallaecian ones, the Iberian sitting statues usually depict goddesses. Some few statues of feminine divinities are also known, representing a standing nude woman only wearing a torque, as the male warrior statues. Severed heads. Similar to the têtes coupes from France, they represent dead heads, and were usually located in walls of ancient hill forts, and are still found reused near of them. Unlike all the other types, these are more common in the north. Pedras formosas, or elaborated and sculpted slabs used inside saunas, as doorframe of the inner room. Architectural decoration. The houses of the Oppida of southern Galicia and northern Portugal frequently contains architectural elements engraved with geometric or auspicious motives. Rosettes, triskelions, wheels, spirals, swastikas, string-like and interlaced designs, among others. Pottery and other crafts. Pottery was produced locally in a variety of styles, although wealthier people also possessed imported Mediterranean products. The richest pottery was produced in the south, from the Rias Baixas region in Galicia to the Douro, where decoration was frequently stamped and incised into pots and vases. The patterns used often revealed the town where these were produced.